Welcome everybody to the Financial Freedom Fighters podcast, back with another episode today. I'm your host, Jacob Sandoval. I have with me my partner in crime, my co-host, Realtor Michael Magno. Mike, how's it going? How you doing on this beautiful Friday?
I am doing great, Jacob. It's a beautiful sunshiny day here in Cleveland. A little warm, but we'll take it. We had a lot of closings this week, so it's been a very good week here, in Cleveland, Ohio. How are things with you?
Everything's going well. I mean, it was a stressful week. I'm definitely glad it's Friday. Stressful because we are coming down to the wire with our Airbnb. So if you've been listening to the past kind of episodes of the Financial Freedom Fighters podcast, several episodes ago, we dove into my latest acquisition. It is a luxury lakefront property in northern Michigan. We bought that property. It's the biggest property I've ever purchased, but there was quite a substantial rehab component of this before we could launch it as an Airbnb. Mike and I have talked about this several times. Mike is an experienced flipper in Cleveland, and he warned me that rehabs never go according to plan. And so here we are. Our first guest checks in on August 2nd. As we record this today, it is July 26th. It'll probably be released and hopefully all this played out in a positive way. But it's July 26th. Our first guest for the Airbnb checks in August 2nd. But the rehab is not done, Mike. The rehab is not done.
Wow.
We have no furniture in the house yet, but the furniture is on its way. We do have a crew of people, 7 to 10 people, that are showing up to the property with the furniture, ready to assemble everything in a matter of a few days. My business partner, also my best friend, shout out to Kevin, if you're listening to this, he is at the property right now, just kind of supervising the contractors, asking them every day if we're going to hit the timeline. So I'm not going to lie. And, if you're a listener of the Financial Freedom Fighters podcast, Mike and I keep it real. We keep it real with the good, the bad, and the ugly of real estate investing. And I'm not going to lie, I am stressed out. I'm stressed out, and I'm really hoping we hit this timeline. I'm really, really hoping we hit this timeline. We have to. It's not an option. The guest has to check in. But yeah, Mike, so that's kind of where I'm at right now with my Airbnb.
Well, that is quite the revelation, my friend. That's quite the revelation. Boy, that's cutting it close, to say the least. I mean, I've listed properties of mine that I'm rehabbing with one or two things that need to be done to it. It's usually stuff that you can't see. Right. But the fact that you've got guests that are going to be showing up here in a matter of 6 or 7 days and you don't have any furniture yet, that's a little scary, my friend. So,
Yeah. So I'll have to update everyone. Mike, we'll have to do a future episode in a couple weeks, and hopefully we'll be celebrating that we pulled it off.
All right.
And that the contractors got it done, the furniture got delivered and assembled, and the guests checked in, and we got a 5-star review. We'll have to update you on a future episode. But that is not what we are talking about today. The episode for today is a great topic. It's a question I get a lot. It's a question I'm sure you might get a lot as well. But the question is, should I pay off my mortgage? And this is a question that applies not only to, real estate investors, but also to if you own your primary home. It's just a question of, I'm paying the bank every single month. I'm paying them principal, I'm paying them interest, and maybe I don't want to wait the full 30 years. Maybe I want to pay that down sooner. And so it is a very nuanced topic. Right? I don't think it's very black and white. You're going to meet a lot of people that think this is a black and white answer, and I just don't think it is. And I don't think Mike thinks it's that black and white of an answer either. We're going to dive into this topic today. I'm going to kick it over to you, Mike, first. Should you pay off your mortgage?
So it's a great question. And yes, we do get posed that question a lot. And I think it just depends, very generically. It depends on the person. Depends on where you're at in your journey. Depends on the property, right? Depends on what it brings in rent. I've got mixtures of stuff, right? And when you look at it too, it's like it can be very, very different. So like I have a property that's at 9% right now. I took out a mortgage on it in December. Yeah, but it cash flows $450 a month. So what do I care, right? I have another property. I have a duplex that I've talked about on the show before. I don't have a mortgage on that property at all, right? I own it free and clear. I bought it with cash. I spent $45,000 in renovations in cash, and now it brings in $1,500-ish, $1,600 a month in revenue. So I don't have a mortgage on that property. Now, it's nice. I could go get a mortgage on it if I wanted to and pull cash out. I just haven't needed to do that. So that's another instance where I've got one. My primary residence, I know you guys rent, right? In
Yeah. Yeah, we
in the
rent.
Bay Area, you rent.
Yep.
So I have my primary residence as well. We have like a 4% mortgage on it. We owe, I don't know, 100, maybe 190,000, 185,000, something like that on a $500,000. You know, I'm not in a big hurry. I pay a little bit extra on it every month just because, you know, I'm not in a huge hurry to pay it off. I don't need to pay it off. Plus at 4%, like if I were to put, let's say, you know, the mathematics of it, right? If I wanted to put an extra $1,000 towards the principal every month, okay, that's well and good. That's $12,000 in a year. You know, can I go take that $12,000 and make more than 4%? Probably. You know, can I go make 10, 12, 20% on that money? Probably. You know, so that's where you have to you just kind of, you know, work through the numbers, the mathematics of it all, and kind of get where you're comfortable.
I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think there's a lot of different elements that we can kind of take this conversation, but I think you started at a very logical place, Mike, which is the interest rate. So the interest rate is the logical place to start because as Mike kind of alluded to here, if you pay down your mortgage, your rate of return on those dollars is effectively equal to the interest rate. And so using that logic, then it can kind of guide you to a framework by which you might assess whether or not it's worth it. Mike already said, hey, if my mortgage rate is 4%, which, you know, the mortgage rates are kind of floating, I think in the sevens right now, high sixes, low sevens, depending on if it's an investment property or a primary residence. So 4% looks great today, right? And so Mike is saying, if I pay down a 4% mortgage, the opportunity cost of doing that is, you know, investing in something else where he can potentially get better than a 4% return. It's probably pretty safe to say in today's environment that he can probably invest and get a better return because you can invest in a CD. You can invest in a high yield savings account and get a 5.5% return right now with interest rates being where they're at. So paying down a 4% mortgage, probably not the smartest in today's environment. Now, if you go on the flip side and your mortgage, like Mike said, is at 9%, 8 to 9%, then it gets a little bit more nuanced, right? Mike's property cash flow, so he's not really stressed about the 9%, but using the logic of my interest rate is my rate of return on the dollars that I use to pay down the mortgage, 9% is not a bad return. The S&P 500 is probably going to get you anywhere from 8 to 10%. So could you generate something that is going to generate a 9% return? I think then it becomes a little bit more debatable, right? Because that paying down the mortgage on a 9% return, basically a guaranteed 9% return on your money if you pay down that mortgage versus, I don't know, maybe the stock market's down 5% that year. Maybe the stock market's up 12%. We don't really know. On average, it's usually 8 to 10%, but paying down a 9% interest rate mortgage is a 9% return. That's the way that you should think about it. So anyway, on the topic of interest rates, the way that I think about it is anything that is less, that is like a 5% return or 5% interest or less, my instinct is to say, don't pay that off, right? My instinct is to say that most of the time, you probably can generate a better return if your interest rate is 5% or lower. That's where you probably want to hold on to that. If it's, you know, higher than 5%, you're in the 6s and 7s and 8s and 9s, then generally speaking, maybe paying that off is not the worst decision in the world. But that is just a very, very narrow view of the interest rate. That's just a very narrow view of the interest rate. But as we know, Mike, investing is not that black and white. There is more to it than just the math. So you want to kind of comment on, you know, a different way to kind of think about the decision other than just the math.
I think another big factor on the math is where you're at in your investment journey. You know, if you're in the twilight and you're getting closer to retirement age and you just want to have that cash set aside and have that, you know, almost, I don't want to say guaranteed return because there's nothing guaranteed, but you know, you want to have a larger chunk of monthly income, then yeah, it probably would make sense for you to pay it off faster. You know, that's a lot of people, you know, if you think about it from that perspective, and when you're taking out 30-year debt, right, on properties, you're planning to pay it off over a period of 30 years, or you're planning on having the tenants pay it off over a period of 30 years. And, you know, so that's one way to look at it as well. And then the other thing to do, a lot of people think about on the other end of it is the ones that like taking on debt, is the fact that debt it's non-taxable income, right? If you refinance a property and you take money out of it, because you're not taxed on debt. So there's different ways to use that debt too, right? Like I mentioned, I've got that duplex that doesn't have a mortgage on it. eventually I'll probably pull money out of it or sell it, right? That's what I probably will do with it. I'll sell it and 1031 it into something bigger, and it'll be a huge down payment for me on another property. But so there's different ways to go about it, but that's kind of where I think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you made a great point, Mike. It's not just the interest rate, right? You have to also take into account the context of where you are in your investing journey. Coach Chad Carson of Bigger Pockets fame, he wrote the book Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor, which I think is a great read. He basically talks about kind of two different phases of your investment journey. He calls it the growth phase, and then he calls it the kind of harvesting phase. And I think it is a really nice framework to think about which phase of your investing journey are you in. Are you in the growth phase? Because if you're in the growth phase, like Mike and I are still in the growth phase right now, then good debt is usually an accelerant to growth. It amplifies your return because, when you put down 20% on a property and that property appreciates, your return on your actual down payment is accelerated because you only put a portion of the down payment, but you're getting 100% of the gain, right? So most real estate investors in the growth phase are like, how can I take on more debt? That's actually the conversation for them. How can I take on more debt? Which is fine, right? That's the phase that you're in. But there is going to be a time where, look, I bought all these properties and I don't necessarily want to buy more properties, but I don't necessarily, or maybe I don't yet have the cash flow from my current real estate portfolio that I need to go into retirement. And if the answer is not to buy more properties because you're kind of tailing into that ender phase or harvester phase, like Coach Carson calls it, then a very logical thing to do is to pay down the mortgage. And Thatch Nguyen, he's probably one of my favorite real estate influencers. He's based out of Seattle. Very, very hilarious real estate investor, great content. I recommend giving him a follow. But he also talks about the fact that, look, if you just buy 10 properties that are paid off free and clear, you pretty much achieve financial freedom. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. You buy one property a year, every single year, and then you spend the next phase paying them down, and you're set. It's really hard to argue with that logic. Taking interest rates off the table, taking all that stuff off the table, and you're just 10 properties free and clear. It's really, really hard to lose in that scenario.
Even in a low cost of living area like Cleveland, right? Like if you had 10 paid off single family homes that are renting for $1,500 a month. Do the math, right? It's $15,000 in gross revenue. Now you got taxes and insurance. I get it. Let's say that's $5,000. So now you've got $10,000 a month in just pure net cash flow. Not that everyone can't, not that everyone's financially free at $10,000, but
most people would be close.
Yeah. The majority of our country would be financially free or could be financially free at $10,000 a month in mostly passive income.
Yeah. And so, it's hard to argue with that logic. So it's like, I think if you're saying, look, I'm in growth mode right now, and in growth mode, it should be every dollar going towards acquisition. That's kind of how you should view it. Every dollar that I have, I'm stashing it away. I'm investing it either in the stock market or I'm saving up for a down payment in real estate. And every single, all that energy goes into acquisition in growth phase. This is why it's so important to have your goals, Mike. And we always talk about this. Before you jump into the world of real estate investing, you should have a vision of what you're trying to build towards, because you don't want your real estate portfolio to be this Frankenstein portfolio where you were just acquiring without any vision, without any strategy, without any thought to what the end state looks like. If I talk to a real estate investor, or Mike, you talk to somebody that wants to invest in Cleveland, you got to start with the vision. You got to start with the goal. And we had a very similar conversation several years ago when I talked to you first. I was like, look, Mike, I want to buy one rental property a year for the next 10 years. And then probably start thinking about paying some of those down, and I still kind of have that same view. Because it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. And obviously there's going to be shifts and nuances and different things that you're going to try in that time period. But just having that clarity, the fact that I'm okay to not have 100 doors, 50 doors, whatever doors. That's not my end game here. I want to have actually, and this is what Coach Carson says in his book, Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor, as few properties as necessary, but still accomplishing that cash flow goal. What a beautiful thing, right? We don't want to just have properties. What we care about is cash flow, and paying down your debt unlocks the most cash flow out of a single property, agnostic of the interest rate. And here's another thing too. We aren't robots. We don't behave algorithmically. People make emotional decisions. People make bad financial decisions. That's why the stock market is what it is, right? You buy high and you sell low because people are emotional creatures. So the idea that, hey, I'm not going to pay down my 6% mortgage because that's mathematically a dumb thing to do. Well, what if you actually just spent all that money? Because people would do that. And so when you compare it to that, people are like, oh, I'm going to put in the S&P 500. But how many people are actually doing that, Mike? How many people are actually doing the optimized thing? My guess would be the vast majority of people are not. So actually paying that 6% mortgage down is a great move if you know yourself and you know that you're actually not going to do something better with that money. Go ahead, Mike.
Actually, I'm chuckling because, as you guys know that listen to the show, I have a daughter who's almost 17 now. She wants to buy herself a new gaming computer, right?
Okay.
So she's been bugging me. She found one. She saved the money. So I sat down with her this morning and I said, I want to show you something before we buy this computer. So I want to show you something. I go, we can turn that computer into $1 million. And she goes, what do you mean? I go, well, let me show you this. And I had an investment calculator out to show her, starting with $1,000 and investing $200 a month for 40 years. So $200 a month, 40 years, never anything more. And I used a conservative 9% rate of return over those 40 years. It would turn into just under $1 million. It was like $960,000 or $980,000. I was just like, so this is what you're potentially giving up, right?
What did she say?
She just kind of looked at me and she's like, but I, just trying to justify it. Anyway, we made a deal. This morning. So here's the deal. She turns, she's still about she's 16 and a half, basically. So I told her, I said, tell you what, you've saved the money to buy this computer. You can buy the computer. It's your money. I said, but let's do this. Let's make a deal. Because she now has a job too. That's the other thing. She's got a job. So now I'm trying to teach her about taxes and paying yourself first, things like that. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. We'll get the computer. If you promise by the time you're 17, so you got 6 months, you're going to save $1,000. I said, and at 17, we're going to put that $1,000 into a brokerage account. I said, then you're going to start making those $200 monthly payments into the brokerage account. And from there, you're going to, 40 years, you're going to be a millionaire.
No, I love that. That's such an important conversation. And I love that you had that. And I'm glad that you guys struck a deal. I think most 16-year-olds would be like, I don't care, whatever. It's so hard to get them to think in those terms. So I love that you were able to, have a little bit of an education moment there.
She's got a little bit of entrepreneurial bone in her. It's not when it comes to real estate. She sees her mom and I do this, and she knows that we do really well with it. Obviously, we've shared a lot of that success with her. But on the flip side, she wants to kind of figure out her own things too, and I'm good with that. Like I've just told her, like, hey, if this computer is what is going to really, really make you happy, then okay, let's do it. Let's go buy it. It's not the end of the world, no big deal. But I just wanted to show her the power of what can become right over time.
100%. And so I think we're getting close to the end of the topic today, but I did want to kind of throw out a couple of other things to think about with respect to this topic. And so one of the things that I really like is this concept of the debt pay down snowball. And the concept of this is, look, okay, say you acquire these 10 rental properties. You buy one rental property a year, every year for the next 10 years. And that's kind of your growth phase. And then at that point, you're like, look, my gross revenue on this rental property portfolio is kind of where I want it to be. I just need to unlock more cash flow from it. And that's where you shift to the debt pay down strategy. And you could think, oh, maybe I'm just going to pay a little bit extra on each of my rental properties. But in fact, that's not what you should do. You should take all your excess cash flow from your rental property portfolio and target it at one property and accelerate the pay down and pay extra payments on one property. And then what's going to happen is you're going to be able to pay that property down pretty quickly, right? Taking excess cash flow, extra payments targeted at one property. And then what happens? All that cash flow from that one property that's freed up from the debt, that's more cash flow. And then what do? You point that cash flow snowball to the next property. And then the second property gets paid down. And then that payment unlocks more cash flow. And then you go to the third, then you go to the fourth. And that's why it's a snowball. And so that concept, I don't know what it is about it, but it's always resonated with me, the idea of it. And that's where I just really like that idea. I really like the idea of the debt snowball. I really like the idea that at a certain point, you don't need any more rental properties. You just need more cash flow. And it is the most logical way to unlock more cash flow out of your rental properties is to pay down the debt. And last thing, Mike, before I kind of pass it to you for any closing thoughts, is Coach Carson had another way to think about this as well, where he was like, look, I had a scenario, and this is Coach Carson's example. I had a scenario where he had $100,000 of debt left on a property, $100,000 of debt left on a property. And his total payment for the year, principal and interest, is $10,000. If he paid off that $100,000, he would unlock $10,000 of cash flow because that's how much the principal and interest was for the year. That's a 10% return. That's a 10% return. If you're thinking about, if I just put $100,000 down, I'm getting $10,000 of return on that in free cash flow. That's a 10% return. So all this to say, a different lens for it is, at a certain point, your remaining balance on your mortgage compared to the amount of cash flow it's going to unlock, there's going to be a point where that ratio starts to flip and starts to make a lot of sense, because you could say I could put $100,000 into another rental property or into the stock market, or I can de-risk my current portfolio and unlock $10,000 of cash flow a year. Mike and I are trying to hit on a lot of nuances. At the end of the day too, it's a very personal decision. Do what feels right for you. Do what feels best for you.
The one thing I'll throw out there too, and this goes back to, and I think Chad actually touched on it in his book as well. You could also look at, taking one of your properties at the end, right? Like, say you buy 10 over the next 10 years and you spend, an additional 2 or 3 years paying them off. And then you could look at the appreciation that you've seen in one of your properties. And maybe you've got enough equity built up in one property to then knock out 2 or 3 or 4 different mortgages off of your ledger altogether. So, that's one way to look at it too. Also, the other thing too that I tell people oftentimes is, you don't have to put the minimum amount down either, right? Like, I think what happened is we got into such a long period of time in this country with such low interest rates that all the pundits and all the Instagrammers of the world that were like leverage, were doing the maximum leverage, but the rates were so low, they were artificially low, and the cash flow was artificial too. I had a conversation with a client today. He's got about $85,000 he wants to put into play. And he was thinking, well, could I pay cash for a property? You could, or you could split the money up, right? I gave him a scenario where splitting the money up was actually going to make him more money than paying cash for one property. And doing it that way, I mean, he wasn't that heavily levered, 30% down, that's a good loan. It's a good loan to value. You're really getting into maximizing your cash flow at that point. You're going to get better interest rate. So it all really depends on people's, there's a lot of factors involved, risk tolerance, and your income, right? Your income matters too. Can you pay the mortgage if you don't have a tenant? We're in a point in our lives where, if we don't have a tenant for a month, it's not hurting our way of life, right? But if you're a new investor and you only make, you're barely making, I don't know, just pick an arbitrary number, $60,000 a year or whatever, and you've got 3 rental properties that are, maxed out leverage, and you don't have a tenant for a month, that's going to hurt. So that's another factor, I think, that, has to be said, and I have this conversation with people very often, right? Because I get as we've talked on many episodes before in my real estate sales business, we get a lot of people who call us first time investors, right? And I always ask, that's one of the parts of the questions in my consultation. I ask them, how much capital do you have to put at risk, right? Because we want to set you up for success. We don't want you being strapped, right? So somebody will tell me I've got $50,000, and I'll say, no, you've got $40,000 because you want to have $10,000 set aside. Because oftentimes they'll get pre-approved, and the loan officer will max out what they can get pre-approved for based on the cash that they have, right? They're not taking into consideration that that's a rental property and they need to have rainy day funds and things like that. So that's where oftentimes I'll throttle people down. I'm pre-approved for $250,000. Well, you don't need to spend $250,000. Let's maybe spend $150,000, right? And it's less money for me. Like, I get paid a percentage, But at the end of the day, we're setting you up to be better, more successful with what you're doing.
Absolutely. 100%. Definitely a massive tip right there. Take it from somebody that did, put all their capital at one point in time into a particular deal and then not having the reserves to kind of back it up when the inevitable thing happens with that rental property. That didn't feel great. So you go forward and you make sure to keep a little capital aside. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found the episode for today helpful. Again, we just want to arm you guys with the information, the different ways to think about things as you make these decisions in your investment journey. If you enjoyed the episode today, or any of the other episodes of the Financial Freedom Fighters podcast, Mike and I would really appreciate a 5-star review. I am Jacob Sandoval. You can find me at all socials at Cashflow Saga. He is Michael Magno. You can find him on all socials at Realtor Michael Magno. We are the Financial Freedom Fighters podcast. We will see you in the next episode. Peace.
See ya.